welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our July 2022 Boston Office 365 user group. Brief introduction to the organizers of the group. Dimitri with Turn Digital. We also have Mike Dixon with Wellington Street Consulting and Bill Gunning with the Executive Office of Technology Services and Security for the state of Massachusetts. It's a handful. So in case you weren't able to connect with us last time, we had a Microsoft 365 peer roundtable. If we've posted the video on YouTube, so definitely take a look if you're interested to hear about some of the open conversations regarding things that have worked well, challenges that others have been facing, and we've even brainstormed a few solutions together. So that being said, let's talk about some of the updates since last time. Of course, if you paid attention to the message center, there's probably a few hundred updates a month. We've tried to boil down a few that we believe are going to be the most impactful in a good way or just in a change way to our users here. So the first topic is really solving a problem with the lack of the ability to nest Azure AD groups within groups, meaning M365 groups. So there's a new concept that's in preview at the moment where you can now define static groups and then build a dynamic group that reflects the membership of those static groups. So in essence, you have the ability to have nested groups that are now going to be available within the platform. So I know I'm super excited about this. I definitely want to give it some hands-on testing to see how that propagates well to the other services. But so far, this looks like a pretty neat solution that should work across the board. The next, many of you may have noticed there's a new ability to chat with yourself in Microsoft Teams. By default, it's going to be pinned as the first item. And I think it's a good place to just draft items, play around with some of the functionality of, posting announcements or playing with the different memes. But it also gives you the ability to have one quick notepad place across multiple devices. So if you're not already using OneNote or other to-dos or other applications, this could be a quick and easy way to remind yourself to follow up on something while you're on the run. Another feature that's coming out is suggested replies in Teams Desktop. So just like your phone might predict what your response might be to a text message, you'll now have a few callouts that you can click on where if somebody says, do you want to join us for lunch? You might see an automatic suggested reply of like, yes, no, or maybe, where are we going? Just saves you a few clicks or a few types to respond. Next up, there's another feature that's going to be pretty neat, which is to detect stale meetings and end them. So we've all been in scenarios where we're recording a meeting and there's one person that forgets to log off at the very end, or perhaps they're logged on across multiple devices and one of them lingers on. And in that case, you might have a 5-hour recording for a 20-minute meeting. So this new feature is going to prompt the person to see if they still want to stay on or not. And if they don't respond, it'll automatically end the meeting. So definitely looking forward to that. Next is Microsoft Stream, which is the Stream web app. So as many of you are aware, Microsoft made a decision to not continue developing Stream as it was a few years ago. It lacked a lot of features that customers were looking for, things like external sharing, better group management, retention policies, DLP, and Microsoft either needed to build up those enterprise-grade features on that web app or that service, or they could find a better way of doing it. And given that SharePoint was natively capable of doing all of the above, they decided to really convert Stream to be a web app. So think of it more like if you open a Word file within a document library, it launches the Microsoft Word Online experience. Same scenario, well, now you'll be putting your videos within a library, you click on it and it'll open up the new Stream web app experience. And the same thing, of course, applies if you wanted to embed that on a page, just like you could embed a Word file using the file viewer web part. You can now also embed videos using that same file viewer web part. So Microsoft's been really building up this web app, and it looks like a lot of these features are going to be rolling out within the next couple of months. Along the same lines, there's another new feature coming where you're able to now record videos directly from the start page within the Office web. So this will give you the ability to very quickly, like if we take a step back, prior to this feature, let's say you wanted to spontaneously record a video and post it to your intranet or record it for later training purposes. you basically had to go ahead, open up your camera app, record the video, then decide to upload the video into your OneDrive or a SharePoint site, and then link out to it from there. This lets you record directly into your OneDrive. In addition to that, they're also giving us options to do some effects like backdrops, text overlays, and other things that you're probably familiar with if you have used TikTok or equivalent platforms. So pretty cool. We're excited for this feature coming out, and this will be available next month. Another feature that I think most of our enterprise clients are very excited about is that Outlook from Mac will now support retention policies. So previously, you could assign it on the server side, but users didn't really have a good way of changing the classifications on the client. So this is rolling out now and should be done later this month. All right, another very exciting feature that was announced last week is a concept called Manage Environments for the Power Platform. This is currently in public preview. And one of the challenges with the Power Platform is that things are fairly wide open. So if you have a license for a per user or per app plan, you're able to connect to outside connectors, you're able to share the app across the board. There's not a lot of insights for when people stop using an app or it's not being maintained any further. So with this new type of managed environment, you can now take a lot of those governance things that you would have to develop by yourself or build ETLs or data lakes to constantly go and enforce what's considered stale or what's considered overly exposed, etc., by letting Microsoft do that for you now. So pretty soon, well, not pretty soon, if you sign up for the public preview today, you'll be able to define a list of policies, and it'll do things like send you weekly updates for, Power Apps or flows or other environmental elements that are no longer being used, things that are being overly shared. You can define policies to say you can't share anything within this environment. And ultimately, this just gives us a little bit more of that enterprise control that we would need from a platform like the Power Platform. So if you have, I've signed up for the preview today. If you haven't signed up yet, I would highly recommend it. All right, so huge thanks to the company I work for, Turn Digital, for being our platinum sponsor. They help keep the lights on and pay all of our regulatory bills, all of our Eventbrite and other fees as well. So thank you to Turn Digital. So with that being said, I think this brings us to our main event for tonight. So we have Mr. Bob German talking to us about the introduction of the Microsoft Graph for low-code, pro-code, and IT admins. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic and screen share over to Bob.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me. That's and thanks for the recap. I had missed a couple of those, so I'm going to join these meetings more often. That was very helpful. So yeah, we can be informal, right? So just, I guess if somebody has a question or a comment or anything, just unmute or throw something in the chat or whatever. I don't want to be overly formal about this. This is just sort of a general introduction to the Microsoft Graph, which is the kind of universal API for Microsoft 365 and Office 365. And actually, before I kind of jump into all this, how much time do I have? When do you want me to stop?
Anywhere between an hour and 75 minutes is fine.
Oh, okay. Well, that should be very comfortable then. So yeah, plenty of time for conversation if you all have questions or anything. So I know some of you I know, but for those who I don't, I'm Bob German. I live in Southern New Hampshire. I'm a Boomerang employee at Microsoft. Now I am a cloud developer advocate, which is a lot of fun. And I love building collaborative apps with all these different tools. I have to admit, I'm kind of only a dabbler in Power Platform. So when I show that, it will, forgive me for the silly simplicity of my demo. But anyway, let's dig into it. Now, I think a lot of you have probably heard of the Microsoft Graph. Perhaps you saw the giraffe at the Worldwide Insider Dev Tour a few years ago. So it's a lot of fun. I think what the Graph does is it's an API that allows you to reach in to Microsoft 365 and get all kinds of information about all of the information that users are working with every day. And it's subject to the same security rules that the UI would be. So it's not, it's not like you're going to be risking any of your information. And in fact, we're going to get into a bit of the authentication and authorization rules of it as we go. But, some examples are that if you want to look at a user's calendar, or maybe access files that are in SharePoint and OneDrive, maybe you want to interrogate the team structure so that you can post something in Microsoft Teams, or you just want to post something. You want to know the user's presence. These are all things that you can do with the Microsoft Graph. So before we dig into it, though, I want to kind of take a bit of a flashback and explain maybe a little bit of background of why the graph exists and what is really kind of behind it. If you kind of go back to the olden days, when everything was on premises, we had a handful of client programs and we had a few major servers, SharePoint, Exchange, Link being notable among them. And the way that this worked was that each user had a computer. It was kind of the client server model. They had a computer, and that computer would connect to these 3 servers, or however many. I'm leaving Active Directory out and other things, but and actually there's connections between the individual client programs and these servers. So this works okay at kind of an enterprise scale. And if you have C clients and S servers, you end up having C times S connections. What ends up happening, though, is when we move into the cloud, first of all, we introduce microservices. So some of these services get broken down into smaller pieces. They added a bunch of services. Meanwhile, the clients multiplied as well. So we were suddenly accessing it on our phones, on our tablets. And so the number of connections starts to proliferate and becomes a lot of overhead. It's a point of failure, and it's also something where if you're on one of these mobile phones and it decides to connect to 5 different services, if it has to authenticate to each one, you're going to be kind of waiting for a long time for the phone to come up with meaningful information. So in one of the rare examples in computer science where adding another layer actually makes things faster, it almost always slows things down. The graph is an aggregation layer, not an aggravation layer, I hope, which actually brings all the services together into, you can think of it as more like a proxy server. It's going to bring all those services together under one location on the internet. So these clients can do one authentication, one DNS lookup, and there's some other things that you can do now that you've kind of concentrated the connections. First of all, you now have C plus S connections, right? So a lot fewer connections to worry about. Some of the things you'll see in here, one is support for the me keyword. So when we dig into the rest, you'll see me, and me is whoever's logged in to your application at that time. So that is possible because the graph is actually adding that information and figuring out who you are and filling in the information for which user's data to query kind of automatically. It can also track relationships between things. Have you ever noticed that, like in the old days, you would work on a document, maybe you were in Word, and you'd be working on the document and save it, and then you want to email the document, and it's like you've never used this computer before. It's like you got to go find the document. I was just editing it 3 seconds ago, and now I have to find it, and I have to navigate and remember where I put it. Have you noticed that in the last few years that's changed? And a lot of times, if you go to attach a document or bring it into a team or something, it actually remembers across all the different tools where you were editing and suggests, oh, here's the document you just closed 3 seconds ago. You probably want to make that be your first choice of something to mail out, right? That's all because the graph is actually tracking all that information and making it available across different services. And I'll actually show a small example of that. It also allows caching, geolocation, logging, centralized tracing. So there's a ton of advantages to this approach. So without further ado, let's kind of go in and look at the Microsoft Graph. And the best way to do that is through a tool called the Microsoft Graph Explorer. And you can go there by going, and thanks for fading on me. That was my fault. aka.ms/Graph Explorer will get you there. And so let me bring up my browser and show you. So I'm here, and I don't know how many of you have used the Graph Explorer? I don't know how to take a quick poll on here. But if you have, maybe you'll pick up some new aspects of it, because they've been changing it around and enhancing it lately. So you'll see here, it looks a little bit like the tool Postman, which is a tool for manipulating REST interfaces, for calling REST, by the way, stands for Representational Entity State Transfer, because computer people really want to just confuse everyone with fancy names. It's all about how fancy of a name can you come up with, and it has to make a nice acronym. So REST, isn't that clever? So anyway, they're just using the HTTP protocol that's been used in web browsers forever to get data. That's all it is. So here we're going to do a GET request, which is one of the HTTP requests, against version 1 of the API. So we don't need the beta for this, and it's going to be /me. So I'm just going to get information about me, and I find out that I'm Megan Bowen, and it's like, wait a minute, I'm not actually Megan. So the reason for that, and you can get a little clue here, is you're currently using a sample account. So let me log in, and I'm still not gonna be myself. I'm gonna be Alan from this demo tenant. And the first thing it does is it asks for some permission. It wants to sign in and read your profile and maintain access to data. So it's like, okay, I'll do that. And we're going to come back to that and look at that in a little bit more depth in a few minutes. So now if I run the same query, it's going to say I'm Alan. So still not really Alan, but whatever. And then you can see all these other kind of options that are there. For one thing, I can actually query and see some code snippets. And some of these back-end services are a little slow today, and I'm not sure why. But it will actually pull up a code sample in these different languages on how to make this particular call. And it was working before, and probably if I was more patient, it would eventually come in. I can also use the Teams toolkit, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, which will nicely render this data, although we're back to Megan again somehow. Or it will render in an adaptive cart. So there's a few different ways to kind of deal with this data. And there's a ton of different samples. So let me come down, for instance, to Teams. Maybe I'm trying to decide where to send a message to what team. And so I want to know, what teams is this user a member of? So that would be this one, get my joined teams. So look at the query. It's me/join teams. So it's still using this me. Guess what? You could put a user ID in there if you wanted to query it about some other user, and you knew their ID, right? So let me go ahead and run that. And I get an error because I'm forbidden. Remember, it asked for my permissions. I didn't give it permission to read my teams. So let me kind of come in here, and hoping that this one is a little bit faster, because yeah, it seemed they recently updated the Graph Explorer, and some of these sort of extra functions are just slow. Oh, good. The code snippets are working now, a while after having asked about them. And let's see if permissions will come in for me. Come on. Without this, it's going to be kind of a short demo. Let me try. I'm just not good at being patient, I think. I'll refresh the whole thing. Am I still logged in as me? Yeah, I am. Okay, good. So now it's going to actually list all the possible permissions. So it turns out that just like users need permissions, apps need permissions in Microsoft 365. And so in this case, the app is actually the Graph Explorer. And we're going to go look and see what permissions, where those permissions are set up, after I finish this demo. So the best practice is to take the smallest amount of permissions you need. These are generally listed from small to large, although it's not always completely straightforward because there's sometimes different choices. So, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and grant it now permission to read the directory. And there we go. And you can see that I've got a count of 8 different teams that this user is a member of, and here's all the information. Maybe I don't want to kind of clog up the internet with all this data, or I just want it to be a little bit easier. So now I'm going to use something called OData, which is part of the Irish suite of protocols. OData is the way that if you have a group of data or like a table of data inside of Office 365, OData is the syntax that they use for accessing, for kind of querying that table of data, that virtual table of data. And so this is one of the things that makes Graph is pretty simple, but one of the things that makes it a little more complex is OData. So you put it on the query string. I'm going to put question mark, $select equals, and then all I really want is the display name and the ID of each team. And now you can see I'm just getting the data that I needed. So let me actually come in here, and you'll find that whenever I'm working with the graph, whether I'm writing a PowerShell script or a program of some kind, I always start here. And what I'm really doing is kind of making a roadmap, maybe on the back of an envelope, of how am I going to get the data that I need to show or to work with in my app. Usually there's more than one step. So I'm going to take the ID of one of these. Maybe I want to show the members in a certain team. So the first thing I have to do is find the team using this first call. And then I'm going to take the ID and copy it to my clipboard. And now let's go back down here and find get the members of a team query. And you'll notice there's a little error up here because the query isn't complete. There's this group ID for teams. So let me replace that with the group ID that I just copied. Bang, there we go. Now I can see exactly what's going on. So you tend to sort of do that. Another thing you can do is sort of page through the data. So there's actually, if there was too many members here, I could do a $top and just get the first few rows. Let me show you an example of posting some data, of writing some data out, because it's a little different. So far, we've only read the data, right? So I'm going to go to, this happened to me once before. Microsoft To Do sort of disappeared out of the samples. So I'm going to have to refresh it again. It was right there. See how this, see if I can get through this demo. It's definitely.
Bob, while that's coming up, we actually have a question from the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Russell wants to know if you have any idea when accessing the SharePoint list data, is throttling any more lenient if using the graph rather than SharePoint REST API?
Yeah, I think they're going to be exactly the same, because guess what's underneath of the graph is an updated version of the SharePoint REST API. So the throttling is actually the same, coming from the same place. And I'll talk about throttling a little bit later. And anyway, maybe I'm going to move on from this demo. But
and actually, I had a question for you as well. Can you mentioned using this for your PowerShell scripts. For those of us that are perhaps very experienced with PowerShell, but not very experienced with graphs, can you show us how you kind of translate from this Graph Explorer and actually use those use this information in a programmatic way?
That's right. That's like 2 demos down the road.
Okay, great.
I'm already got that one teed up. So
didn't mean to skip ahead.
No, that's great. You know, I have a friend who used to say a good question is a question I know the answer to. A great question is a question I have a demo for. So
awesome.
So that was a great question. All right, here I'm going to go into to do, right? Microsoft To Do, and I'm going to get a list of the tasks of the task lists. So To Do is kind of weird. It has a list. It has multiple task lists. So you've got lists of tasks, lists of lists. I don't know. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself the permission again and do the thing again. And all I really wanted to do was get this list ID, so that, because you can't add a new to-do item in like outer space. You have to put it into one of the to-do lists. So I only have one. This is it. I need that ID. So I'm going to grab this ID, and that would be the first little step on my roadmap. Now I'm going to create a task, and you can kind of see what the query looks like. And again, I've got one of these missing sections in the URL. So those IDs are quite long. And then let's just say, we'll say drink 365 is the to do, and it comes back. So it's that simple, but you just end up having to pass in a payload, you know, some body, some information that you're writing out. And if I come here into my to-do, there it is. So it worked. Yay. All right. So I actually did the whole demo. Amazing. All right. So as you can tell, Microsoft Azure Active Directory is very much involved in all this. And you're probably all pretty familiar with it, so I'm not going to go over it again. But one of the key aspects of it is the way that permissions work. So a lot of us grew up with old school operating systems, including probably the one that the computer that you're sitting at right now still supports this very simple model, because Windows, Mac, and Linux all still do, unless you go to like the Windows Store. You run an app, and it runs on behalf of a user, and it gets all the permissions that user has. So in this hypothetical situation, I've got a user, she's playing a game, and meanwhile, the game is reaching into her contacts list and spamming them all. And she has no way of knowing that particularly, right? Because the app is running with her full permissions. And I actually have an example, right? This is a casual game. Civilization 2, it always wants to read my contacts, and it's not an online game. It's a standalone. So I always say no, it still works, but that's probably saving some, all my friends from getting spammed. With a modern operating system, such as any mobile operating system these days, such as Windows Store apps, and yes, such as Azure Active Directory and Microsoft 365, the apps have to be registered, and they need permission, as well as the user needing permission. The app needs permission, and users or admins have to consent to those permissions, and you saw those consents. So there's 2 different kinds of permission. There's delegated permission, which you're acting on behalf of a user, and in that case, you effectively have the intersection between the user's permission and the app's permission. For instance, if the app has files.read permission, and Alice is a user, she has access to sites 1, 2, and 3, SharePoint sites 1, 2, and 3. She's going to get access. The app running on her behalf is going to be able to only read the files in sites 1, 2, and 3. Can't get to site 4 because Alice doesn't have access. Can't write the files because the app has only files.read. And then there's also app permissions, which you can never do from a web browser because it's just not secure, where you can just run on behalf of the app. And that's really useful for background processing and things like that. I'm pretty sure you're almost always going to be using the delegated permissions. So let me go into another quick demo, just in case you are aware of the of Postman, which is a traditional tool really for for working with REST calls. And I'll just quickly show how this works. You would come in and you'd have to register an app specifically for calling Postman, because Postman is not a web-based app. It doesn't already have an app registration. And you have to grab the app ID, and which is also called the client ID, and the directory ID out of there. And then you also need to put in this callback location. So after Azure AD logs the user in, it sends control back with a redirect to the caller. And here's the magic URL that will get it back to Postman after you've authenticated. And you'll see that in just a second. And then for some of these, if you're going to do app permissions, you need a client secret. So you would have to generate one of those. And then we have the permissions where you would set the permissions. And so that's basically what we've already done. I'm just going to add another one. You can see here's delegated versus app permissions. So you can sort of filter that down right there. And now I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to do Teams again and go into teams.readbasic.all so that I can read information about the teams. And then I'm going to grant consent. So this is doing exactly what I did with the pop-up from Graph Explorer. It's just a different UI because I'm in the Azure portal. So now here I am in Postman, and I've set up an environment. And part of this is to let you know that there's Postman collection for the Microsoft Graph and to show how to use that. And I copied my app ID and my client secret and tenant ID all into there. And then Postman will do the authentication for me. And notice that the URL and all this information is actually coming from the environment with these little squiggly braces around the tenant ID and the client ID. That just tells Postman to pull those values out of the Postman environment. And you can see that they're in there. So now I'm going to go ahead and get an access token. And what it's going to do is pop up a browser and have me log in and then pass the resulting access token back to Postman. And you'll see that you get this, they always start with EY because it's base 64 encoded. So for some reason, I think that's the opening squiggly bracket in some JSON. But anyway, now I can come in and do that same call. What teams am I a member of from Postman? So at the end, I've got the URL of this, but the advantage of this is if you want to do something other than a web browser, if you want to use one of the other authentication schemes, there is a Postman collection for all of the Azure AD protocols and another one for Microsoft Graph. And between the two of them, you can kind of do anything. So I just wanted to kind of make you aware of that. So next, let me show you some scenarios. And these are short JavaScript programs, and they are also Learn Labs that I worked on. So with some of my colleagues. So you can, at the end, again, I'll have a URL where you can go and try most of these, and a couple of them haven't been published yet. And if you run into one of those, let me know, and I'll dig it up for you. So here are the different scenarios that you go through in these labs. And so the first one is going to just get your calendar. And so you can see, if you just kind of look at the code briefly, the way that it works is that first I'm going to add, we're using something called dynamic consent here. So we're asking on the fly for the permissions. So I'm going to ask, make sure I have user.read, and then I'm using the Graph SDK. So I initialized that up here, up on the top. And then I'm going to call just get/me to get back ID and my display name. You saw me do almost that same query, right? And then I'm going to ask for calendars.read, and I'm going to construct this query with a start date and an end date, and I'm going to go ahead and read that. So let's go ahead and run that. And what the lab will do, it's sort of all self-contained. I just type npm start. It downloads a little baby web server, and it pops up. And now when I click the button, I get my calendar. So really simple. They all work kind of that simply. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the code of all of them, but I'll refer you to the labs, and then you can just get an idea of some of the things you can do with the graph. So here I have an application. How many applications need to work with files? Do you need to reinvent files, or would you like to use SharePoint and OneDrive, which already has a ton of capability for file access? So this little sample just shows how to upload and download files. So I can upload this picture, of course, of a giraffe, and it puts it into my OneDrive root folder, and then I can download it. I could also have viewed it, but this is more general, doesn't just work with images, and there's my giraffe, right? So that's another one that you can try and play with. Another one is file insights. And so this is when I was talking at the beginning about how it knows what you were just editing. This is the API. And so in this lab, you get to play around with that. So I can get 3 kinds of insights. One is recently used. Hey, there's the giraffe. One is things that have been shared with me. And then the third one is trending around, which is sort of a little bit more of a fuzzy criteria, but just things that I'm working on a lot, or files that have a lot of activity that I'm working on. So this is all with the me keyword, but if I put in a specific username, then I can get that information about another user, with the exception of the shared with, which you can't ever get because it's just seemed like too sensitive. Notice that if I'm getting the recent files for this other user, I'm only going to see the files that I also have permission to. So if she was editing, the confidential HR plan, I'm not going to see that. I'm only going to see the ones that it will security trim, for me to see. Presence. So this is a big one, right? And here I've got some users, and I've logged some of them in, and I'm just showing their presence. So if I come in and change my presence, it will update. I have to click the refresh button, right? But that's another one that you can learn how to do from the lab. And this last one is probably the one I had the most fun with, and that is the Excel integration. I remember when I was working at the Microsoft Technology Center, where I'm pretty sure I met some of you, doing a project for a company that builds electronics components, and all the formulas were locked away in the minds of these electrical engineer designers, and they really wanted to express the formulas for using these components in Excel. And so we went to a great deal of trouble to integrate their website so that customers viewing their catalog could actually get stats and kind of do what-if scenarios with these electrical components, and it would get cranked through the spreadsheet so that you didn't have, an electrical engineer changing the formula and then have to go get a programmer in to change the website, right? So the idea is Excel, you can actually take a piece of your app, take the functionality, and hand it to some business users with Excel. And so that really is what's going on here. I have a survey spreadsheet, and I'm going to go ahead and sign in, and you'll see that it's going to go and just show me the question, which is up at the top in cell B1, and the choices, right, which are in column A there in that little table, and allow the user to pick a choice and submit it. And what's going to come back is the graph. And eventually it's going to actually update the spreadsheet with that change. I'll kind of tweak it a little to make it happen. And you'll see what's happened is it's added another response to the responses table and updated the graph, right? So now I didn't have to write graphing code, and I didn't have to lock in the contents of the survey. So suppose a business user comes along and they're like, we forgot our favorite kind of bacon is maple glaze, right? So we need to add that to the survey. So you don't have to go update a database or ask, the developers to step in to add that choice. If you know how to edit the spreadsheet, you know how to edit the data. So just some food for thought maybe, and a call to action to go check out the labs. So, I'm sorry, I'm ignoring the chat. Do I find it easier to use Graph Explorer or Postman when developing? Usually I use Graph Explorer. If Postman only if I'm doing app permissions or something fancy that you can't do with Graph Explorer. Because I just like that the samples are there. Half the time what I want is in the sample. Postman has the collection too, I guess. So, but I don't know. I just like it. It's one less thing to think about. Just open the browser and off you go. That's just personal preference. The Graph Toolkit, if you've not heard of it, is a set of web components that allow you to write, to pull graph data onto a web page. So if you know HTML and you don't particularly want to dig into JavaScript programming, this is your friend. Or you can actually still customize these components with JavaScript if you want. So here you can see on line 9, bringing in the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. And then on line 10, it's actually bringing in the Microsoft Teams auth provider, which is MGT. Anything starting with MGT is one of the web components in the Graph Toolkit. So that's just going to go ahead and log me in, make sure that I'm logged in. And then if I scroll down, you'll see that I've got some other pieces here. I've got a login button, I've got an agenda and a list of tasks and some messages. And the messages, I'm using a template. So I made it also supports these templates. So I'm basically saying, look, take the data about my inbox and put it in to this format of, I want a div for each message with, header 4 and the person information, blah, 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 right? And the Graph Toolkit is going to plug all that in. So let's go see this thing run. I'm gonna have to start the software again, just like before. And I can go over to, this particular one is a Teams app. So I'll go over to Microsoft Teams and run this thing. This is another lab. I think I have a link to it that you can try at home. It's a lot of fun. It was written by one of my colleagues, Aicha Bosch, and was used for the Global Developer Bootcamp a couple of years back. So here's the permissions, quite a list actually, because we put a lot of information on there. And there we go. So you've got all this information nicely formatted and kind of following all of the kind of UI best practices that you expect from Office are just baked in there. And I can even check off my to-do list and things like that. Pretty cool. There's also a playground for this. And so to get to that, you go to mgt.dev. And so let me show you that. So it looks kind of like this. Now, this one you can't log into your own tenant. But it shows you what they all look like. So if you want to see, for instance, what the agenda looks like, this is your calendar basically. Or if you want a list of events, there's all these different, options and styles that you can play around with in here. Here's their people picker that you would use to find a certain user. I know Megan's in there because she's everywhere. There you go. So just a pointer to that. It's very helpful. All right, let's move into the next area here, which is going to be Power Platform. So I mentioned I'm not a Power Platform dev, so I'm going to show you. If there's a better way to do this stuff, just yell and set me straight, because I know that I'm a naive user. So let me show you first what the app does. So I'll use it from my mobile device. And all it does, it's the simplest little app. It just, I click a button that says call a graph, and it shows me my profile information. That's it. Obviously, if you're into Power Platform, you can once you know how to call one of these calls, you can probably call a bunch of them and do fancy things. Sorry if I'm not an expert on that. But in any case, how to do it? You have to again you have to register an app inside of Azure Active Directory that is going to be doing these calls, these graph calls from that app. It's not really going to come from Power Platform. It's coming from your app. So I had to register this. I grabbed the client ID and the tenant ID off the registration page, and then went in and set the authentication. Now this redirect URL is something that you're going to get back from Power Apps. It doesn't seem to change. You can probably use this value, but better safe than sorry. You know, when you publish the Power App, it's going to tell you what the URL is and come back and fix it inside of the app registration. Make sure you got it right. Then I'm going to have a client secret, and you have to copy these as soon as you create them, because then it just hides it after that, because it's pretty sensitive information. So treat it accordingly. So now that I've got that, all that information, I'm just going to come in and create a custom connector. So I was in custom connectors, I clicked add, and that brought me here. And I'm going to make the connector to call graph.microsoft.com. And for authentication, I'm going to use Azure AD, which uses the OAuth 2.0 protocol. I don't really want the generic one though. I want Azure AD, and that'll fill in actually a lot of the fields for me. And then I'm going to paste in the client ID, the client secret, the tenant ID. The resource URL is graph.microsoft.com, and the scope that I need, which is just user.read. And that's all I really have to do. And this will create for me the custom connector. And there it is. And actually, if I scroll down a little bit, if you look here at the bottom, there is the redirect URL, right? So if you just make sure that that's the same as the one in your app registration. And now I'm going to go in and define the different actions that I can take. So you could do this once for graph and then have different methods underneath the graph, different REST calls under different actions. So this one, I'm just going to say get me, and it gets my profile. And then the request is going to be, I love the way this kind of works by example, right? I'm going to put in the query, and it will actually go and based on that, construct the connector. The response, again, it's kind of by example. So I can just paste this in from the Graph Explorer or from Postman, and it will then know what the shape of that is, what that JSON looks like. And then I'll go ahead and update that, and there is my connector. All right, so now I'm going to make a new connection based on that connector. And it's going to ask me to log in to do that, because it's actually going to call the graph. And I'll go ahead and test this out. And yep, it worked. It was actually me. I'm not even pretending to be Alan or anything like that. So now let's go in and make the Power App. So I've already created the app, and I'm going to come in and use that custom connector that I had created. And now underneath the call graph button, I'm going to update my context with user profile data coming from that custom connector.getMe, which was that action. So that will cause it to actually go out to the graph and bring in that information. And then inside of the name and job title fields, I've got it referencing that same object inside a Power App to show the data that came back from the call. And then the buttons are fairly simple. It's just going to either blank everything out if I reset it or exit from the program. And that's it. So that's about as much as I've ever done with Power Apps. So are you proud of me? So, and now we can go ahead and run it. And I'll log in as a different user. And thank you. And bring in this connector. And what you'll see is it's going to actually ask that user the first time to log in. So what's going on under the covers is that it's actually using a feature in Azure AD that we haven't really talked about and getting a refresh token, which is a longer lived token that can be exchanged at runtime for an access token that lets you call the graph. So that is why you only have to do the login every 6 months or so, because those refresh tokens have a longer lifetime. Let me show you a quick SharePoint Framework example, and then I promise I'm going to get to PowerShell after that. This one is just sort of, some of you have probably seen this demo. I wrote it a while ago. It's been around. The idea here is that I've got a group of people who are doing field service or home inspections and insurance adjusters actually, and here's a Teams app that's based on a Power App that I just took out of one of the samples. But this is the field visits, and it's written this is just a SharePoint Framework web part. And the magic of this is the graph. It's really all about the graph. So what did it do already? I want to see what I have to do for field visits this week, and also my teammates. So it went into the team. It interrogated Microsoft Teams to get the members of this team. You saw me do that call a little while ago. And then it's going to read the calendars of those users. And so I can see exactly what the appointments are for my teammates. When I click on one, it's going to give me all the information I need about this particular field visit. So I've got some business data here, which is coming from my line of business system, right? And then I've got some information in the cloud, right, in the form of the map and the weather. But a lot of this stuff, the calendar, as well as these documents, as well as the picture, are all coming from the Microsoft Graph. And so there's just a lot of value in bringing together the information that users need, so that they're not having to kind of flip back and forth. And people are really people are important. People should not be doing these repetitive tasks that a computer could do, like go look up in 5 different systems the information about the same appointment. And so that's kind of what this is trying to get across. In addition, you can post to the channel about this particular appointment, and it will send a message out, and then it has a deep link back to the item, so that if somebody clicks on it, it will bring them into the app pointing to the correct appointment. So if we just take a really quick peek at just some of the code here, you'll see the first thing is that the SharePoint framework nicely gives you a graph SDK. That means you don't have to deal with authentication or anything. It's all handled by SharePoint. Yay. And once I did that, I went on line 31. You can see I'm getting the calendar for this team, which is where we're storing those appointments. And I'm going to do a query of that data. Here's an example of where I'm posting that message with the deep link. So that's another example right here. The only thing you have to do is, in your SharePoint framework solution, you have to specify the permissions that you need. The permissions don't go away. They just kind of get handled more by SharePoint. And then when you install the solution into the SharePoint app catalog or the SharePoint app gallery, it's going to show up in there, and then you'll have to approve the permissions. So Deb, I don't know the answer. I haven't done that much with syntax. I'm pretty sure that it is, I think there are ways of querying that information, but I'd have to kind of look up in the reference and see what's there. So here's my, that was the app that I uploaded. And then here's the API access. And so if you request some permissions, it actually has to be approved by an admin. And here's the screen to do it. And what's kind of unfortunate is, because web parts are shared on a page, by default, all these permissions are going to be organization-wide, meaning every web part in that tenant is going to have those permissions. PowerShell. So here's my little secret decoder ring for how to translate these PowerShell commands, the Graph Explorer into the PowerShell commands. So you've got the verbs get, post, put, patch, and delete. And you can see this is a convention of all REST interfaces that, get means read something, post means create a new thing, put, same thing, except for there is a slight difference. Update is a patch and delete is a delete. And then what you do is you have to kind of figure out what the and usually they're very intuitive, what the noun is. So the verb in REST, and if you're a PowerShell person, you know that you always have verb-noun as your PowerShell command. So the verbs come across one for one, and the nouns are based on the type of object. So if you have team members, for instance, you do have to go look up that it's an MG team member. Usually they're pretty easy to guess because it's MG, which is Microsoft Graph, and then the thing. And that's basically it. And the help files inside of there are quite good. So let me show you a sample of that. So this first example, I'm going to connect to the SDK, to the PowerShell SDK, and you always have to say what permissions you're using. So this is using that dynamic consent thing again. And it's good because if you have a script and it's not supposed to delete all the files, not allowing that, it's kind of an extra fail-safe in case there would be something unintended in your script. So what it's going to do, let's just go ahead and do the connect, and you'll see that it's going to pop up and ask me to log in and ask me to consent to that permission. And then I can go ahead and get the user and filter it to show me. So there, that's the way I would do that. What if I want to know if this user is online or not? So I need an additional permission, presence.read.all. And then when I do that, I can get back the presence string. And they don't really come in as colors, they come in as little strings. So now here's an example of a somewhat contrived but approaching realistic type of script that you might write. I could imagine if I was managing an M365 tenant, a relatively smallish tenant, that I might use a script like this to create teams in a consistent way. So what this one's going to do is it's actually going to create a team. And then the contrived part comes because the team is a little bit silly. But so on line 29, new MG team, right? And then I give it a name and a description, and you can put additional properties, and these come right out of the Graph SDK reference. So, if it's in there, it'll just pass it along. And then this particular call can take a few minutes to run. So if we just continued to update that team at this point, it would fail. So instead, what we're going to do is we're actually going to wait. And so this loop on starting on line 35 it's just going to sit there for 5 seconds, and then it's going to get the team. So I should make a little explanation here because I think I'm doing this sort of right out of habit. So a team in Microsoft Teams is an Office 365 group. And an Office 365 group is always the identifier and the basis of a team. So if you have a team, it's a group. And some of the things about a team, like does this thing exist, you would query it as if it was a group. So I guess you just have to know to look in both places. And you also have to know that a team ID and an Office 365 group ID are the same ID. And then hopefully you won't get too confused. So that's what this is going to do, is it's just going to sit around and loop until it gets the, until that particular group, that team has been created. Then what I'm going to do is, Madeline is in charge of the department, so we're going to add her as an owner of every team automatically. So on line 42, we get her user account and go ahead and make her an owner on line 43, starting on line 43. Then this is where it gets really silly. I didn't have a real scenario, so I decided to just put all the users whose names begin with A into this group. And of course, so we're going to have to call it the A team. And then I'll go ahead and send a message to that channel. So you can see, you know, kind of an initial welcome message. So if I run all this, let's see what happens. And it's going to want me to log in because I just asked for a bunch of new permissions. And this is, I've sped up the video a little bit because you don't really want to wait for that thing to be created. And then I'm adding the users and I sent the message, and now I can go into Teams and hopefully my new team will be there. So we'll just open this up and go to Teams and scroll down. Yep, there it is. There's the A team. And you can see that my message is there. And if I manage the team, Madeline and I are owners because it was my account that created it. So I'm also an owner automatically. And my two users whose names begin with A are also there. So that is a little bit on the PowerShell stuff. Really powerful. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. Let me show you actually an ad hoc demo. I mentioned the permissions before, and I want to not forget to do that. These permissions actually don't go into, you know, a random place. Oh, by the way, here's the REST API reference, and this is so useful because they've actually done a really good job with this. What I love about it is that every one of these methods, if I go into, say, list users, right up at the top is the permissions, and it tells you what they do, and you can, and it says, you know, to always take the smallest one of these permissions, like least privilege. So that's really, really good. Where do those permissions go, and how does this actually work? Well, if I go into Azure Active Directory, and I look for the Graph Explorer. The Graph Explorer is a Microsoft product, so it's registered inside of Microsoft. But every app registration has one or more complementary. They're called enterprise applications, which I think is a silly name. I prefer to call them service principals, and in some of the documentation they still are. So when the app is running in some other tenant, it actually uses the effective permissions of the enterprise app or the service principal. And so I deleted the Graph Explorer from my enterprise applications before the demo. So if I sort by date created, you'll see right here at the top is Graph Explorer. And this is a Microsoft app. It's registered for Microsoft, but I can come in here and see the permissions that have been granted. And I didn't check off admin on any of these. I did it as a user. And here's all the permissions that I had consented to. And here are the users, Alan, who actually requested those permissions or who granted those permissions. So if you're ever wondering as an admin, what are people doing with this? Like I gave some graph permissions to some app. You know, what users are actually using this thing and have granted which permissions. This is how you would do it. And yeah, you can actually come in here safely. This is, you know, this is just a record of what was consented to. If you want to test that again, just delete it, because Microsoft has all the details in their app registration somewhere. And all this really contains is the consents. So just sort of a little tip on how to manage that stuff. So a couple of final thoughts, and I know I can tell that Russ is already probably well aware of this stuff. Any API, any public API on the internet has to have some defense to it, some protections to protect it from being overwhelmed and denial of service attacks, or even if it's legitimate calls, it's a multi-tenant environment. And if you've ever, if you have a cable modem and you know what it's like when all of the neighbors' kids come home and start streaming and playing Xbox and your bandwidth goes away, right? We don't want to do that to people in Microsoft 365. So we enforce some throttling, and in other words, a maximum rate at which you can send and receive data from the graph. And it's actually enforced on a service by service basis. So SharePoint is going to have a different idea of throttling than Exchange Online or some other service. So that's kind of a reality, is that you have to be ready to handle this if you're going to build a robust app. Now, in practice, if you've got a Power App and you're doing 1 or 2 queries, you're probably fine. But if you're writing anything that runs at some kind of scale, these are kind of the rules of the road. You might get back a status code, an HTTP status code 429 or 503 to your request. And what that doesn't mean is, okay, then spin off 50 more requests just like that, because it's already overwhelmed. It's basically saying, cut it out, stop overwhelming me. If there are any protocol wonks here, this is because HTTP doesn't have flow control. Okay, it's a rudimentary form of flow control. So the way this works is that when you get one of those 2 status codes, you're supposed to look at the response header for a field called retry after, and then you wait that number of seconds. And you might get throttled again, but you probably won't. What I'll guarantee is that if you sit there in a tight loop and you don't wait and you just keep pounding away, it's just gonna throttle you worse. So you really want to be aware of that. There's also a special header, which I don't think I have on the slide. I know I don't have it on the slide. I don't think I have a backup slide on this, but I can dig it up. Russ probably already knows. You probably already know what it is, but if you need it, I'll find it for you. There's a header specifically used by SharePoint that will get you a little bit more favor in throttling, that they know kind of what application you are and that you're coming back and that you're okay. So you want to decorate your requests for SharePoint with that. If you have an application that does a whole bunch of file access or any kind of a collection where you're just kind of saying, look, I want to keep track. I'm going to do some regulatory scans or some backups on all the files in some user's folder or in a whole tenant. You want to just sort of follow this general scheme of first figure out where you want to scan, then slowly crawl all the files in those locations. And then there's a thing, there's a change query that you can, a thing called a delta query that you can make, which basically says, now, since I did that crawl, what has changed? And you ask for a notification for a webhook. So the graph actually calls you back and says, hey, you should go check this file. And then you ask, or this folder, because there's probably some more files. And then you just do a delta query and just get the changes. That is much more efficient than sitting there and groveling through the same million files every single time, right? Because there probably weren't really that many changes. So I will put up my list of resources and open it up to any other questions that people might have. And by the way, if you are not aware, and if you're not a developer, you might not know about this. This Microsoft 365 developer program is not just for developers. I mean, it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. It's a program where you get a free development tenant that you can work and play in. And so you could be building Power Apps or PowerShell or all kinds of things and still make use of this. It's a place where you can be a full admin and not worry about breaking anything because there's no real users in there. It's all yours. There you go, Russ. Russ knew this one. Yeah, I have. I've had to deal with this one as well. So that is the definitive article on how to cope with throttling, and it happens more in SharePoint, I think, because people tend to want to, process large batches of files at the same time.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the Graph API reaching feature parity with the rest of the SharePoint APIs that are out there?
My crystal ball is cloudy. I would put it to you this way. This is what I've seen happen, right? Is that they've gotten some new feature and they have a fixed amount of resources. So even though Microsoft has, you look at the money and they're like, yeah, they got a lot of money. Yeah, but yeah, they make money partly because they don't spend recklessly and every department has a budget. So if you're the product manager for SharePoint and you have a choice of adding some cool new feature that's going to get all the users excited, or making feature parity in an API that's going to make some developers excited very quietly and no end users are ever going to notice, which one would you invest in? Given that your goal is, to make the product successful all up. And I think that's the problem.
Point, Bob. So is the Graph API maintained by like a central dev team, or is that maintained by each of the product?
Oh, that's a great question. The answer is kind of it's a cooperative thing. It's really cool. And I have to say, I'm not saying this for their benefit. I don't think there's anybody who's going to hear this anyway. It's really well organized. So there's a central team that manages the graph itself, and that central aggregation is managed by that team. And then they have a partner on every one of the teams of the underlying teams. And so SharePoint, there's a guy who just does the graph on the SharePoint team, and there's another one for Teams, and there's another one for Planner, et cetera, et cetera. And so they cooperate. And so if the person who owns SharePoint wants to add some more features, right, what they have to do is they have to expose an underlying API, which in this case is basically the JavaScript API v2. It's the same as the old SD, the JavaScript underscore API thing that we had before, right? It has some differences to it. It's more consistent with the graph, so it knows about drive IDs and things. But and then so suppose they want to add something new, so they would add it to that underlying API, and then they would update the service definition, and then somebody in Graph would go through the process of onboarding it and testing it and making sure that it that all the security and everything checks out, because the security is handled up in the graph layer for efficiency, right? So, or the authorization, some of it trickles down. I don't know exactly how it all works, but I have been told that this is part of the reason why it's so hard to know when things are going to go GA, which is a kind of a pain point, I think. It's like if you have a graph call that you're really excited about, it's in beta, and what tends to happen is like one day you wake up and it's now released. And if it's not your lucky day, they changed it and your code is broken. And they tell you not to use those things, but I can see the world from both sides, because I've been a partner and I've been with enterprises. And what happens if you have two competing partners and one of them is missing a feature because they're waiting for some API to go GA, and the other one says, well, the salesperson comes around and says, well, we have that feature. You don't have to wait for them. Go buy our product. So it's like there's this competitive incentive for partners to push the envelope and use these things before they're released. So in any case, it's tricky, and it's because there's two groups involved that it's very hard to roadmap those things accurately, because there could be problems on either side, and when it finally passes all the validation tests, then it gets released.
Understood.
How can I get the hash of a file? I don't know that particular thing. I can try to find out for you, John. I don't know off the top of my head. I would think it would be the same. The calls are very similar, but I'm going to guess that if it was the same, you wouldn't have asked. So you probably ran into this. So I'll see if I can dig into that one for you. Rachel has her hand up. Feel free to unmute if you want.
Yeah, I figured it's easier for me to talk.
Yeah.
So I've had it's trying to figure out how to get from the graph all of the call records. We just moved to Teams calling, so our tech support guy is like, I can't see who's calling who, da 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 da. So I'm trying to use the graph to do that. Have you? I know they changed, I think, one of the connectors in Power BI. Like I can't get into that permission right now. It's driving me nuts. And just based on what you've posted, I might switch and do a Power App instead. But I don't know if you've had any, like, it doesn't look like you can actually give those permissions to a user, only to an application. So that's why I've been running into issues, I think.
That is correct. And so this is another thing that happens sometimes with the different groups, and sometimes groups will decide to only support one type of permission or another, and it's the number one request I think for Graph is give us app permissions for Planner, so that you could go in and set up a Planner plan without a user being logged in. This one's the opposite. It only supports app permissions. So at that point, they would have to update the graph to support that. Okay. So depending on how you wanted to do that, I mean, a simple approach might be, but just be careful that you're not like opening a security hole when you're
that's
doing
what I'm scared of.
Yeah, I know. Would be to use, you could probably use something like an Azure function or even a logic app to go in and make those calls and then hide the app secret that's needed. So, both Azure Functions and Logic Apps have the ability to put an Azure AD security on top. Mm-hmm. They call it Easy Auth. There's just a little checkbox, and you can set up the authorization coming in from another caller. Mm-hmm. And then inside of there, you can limit what it can do. So instead of giving it call records.read.all is probably a big permission. Yeah. You can have some logic in there that says, well, I'm going to check and make sure that it's really this user or that user, and I'm going to check certain business rules, and I'm not going to get really just all the records. I'm going to get specific records that the app should have, or whatever it might be, and thus limit the risk compared with just using this willy-nilly, and kind of give yourself a delegated permission on top of the Azure function or logic app.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps. It might be an idea.
Yeah, I'm looking for anything right now.
This one is just the way that they did it was, and I'll bring it down and share the screen so everyone can see what I'm looking at. Right. I just went, and the API, the documentation is pretty good. So it's right here, get call record, and there it is. And yeah, but when it says not supported, it's kind of hard to get excited about it.
Yeah, I know. Accurate, I got excited, and then I'm like, I can't do it.
I know, exactly. So that means that you have to use what's called the client credentials flow, the OAuth flow, to make the call, which is actually a really easy call. It's just one call to Azure AD to get back the access token.
Okay.
But it's sensitive. Right, because you're gonna get back this permission, and then anybody with that token could do stuff.
Yeah, and I just, at least, like, if I could narrow it down, the person is a team owner. I have them call queues in Teams, and it's all in one team. I have tech support all in one team with a channel for each call queue, and he just wants to be able to see what calls are coming in, which is completely understandable.
So then you would create, like I say, either a logic app or an Azure function are the easiest ways to do it.
I like easy.
That basically just take the you know, and the Logic Apps it looks just like Power Automate. They're based on the same thing, right? So you've got shapes that you're gonna, and you go in and you say, is it the user? Is it does this user own that team, or whatever, you know, whatever your business logic is. If yes, then go and get the call records and return them. If no, return a 401 access denied. You know, just don't let it go through.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure. Good luck with that.
Thanks.
Always a new challenge. All right. Well, I guess maybe that wraps it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bob. That has been a great presentation. I've certainly learned a thing or two.
Oh, that's great. Coming from you, that's really good. Thank you. I know you know a lot.
All right. So thanks again to Bob. This was great. All right. So next up, we are having an open call for speakers for most of the sessions for the remainder of this year. If you're interested in speaking, sharing some of your knowledge, we'd be happy to host you. And this doesn't have to be a strict, you know, presentation such as the one that Bob gave. This could also be just a case study or a walkthrough of something that you've taken care of. So that being said, upcoming events. There's a variety of community calls, as Mike was mentioning at the start of today's meeting, that occur every month. So definitely take a look at these if you want to be plugged in further into the environment. SharePoint Saturday, rebranded as Collab Days in New England, is coming back to the MTC in Burlington this October. They've actually just released registrations. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please do and go ahead and register. I know a number of our members are going to be speaking at the conference, as well as sponsoring, so check that out. There's also the European SharePoint 365 and Azure conference happening this November. So if you're interested in traveling to Denmark, definitely check that out. I believe this event is strictly in person. And we have a few additional recurring resources. So they don't necessarily meet on a given schedule, but take a look, and more information available at these links. So that being said, we want to quickly give a quick shout out to the rest of our neighboring user groups. We have the Rhode Island user group that's available, run by DRC Hess. We have the Hartford 365 user group run by Jared. The Granite State user group run by Julie and Jim. And a few other user groups that are in the area. I know with the pandemic, some of these have been a little bit less active than others, but check it out if you have an interest in any of these areas as well. So that being said, this brings us to our next segment, which is, does anyone need help? Is anyone running into any kind of strange issues, problems, or did you run into something that you resolved that you'd like to share with the team? If so, you can unmute yourselves and give us a little heads up.
Now, I have a question, if I may.
Sure, Arthur, go ahead.
Randomly, it appears to take about half an hour before a team site synchronizes. There are multiple computers, and it has a file that changes on one computer, and it sits and people wait half an hour. So I went over today to look at it, and there was no delay whatsoever today. So I couldn't troubleshoot. Any thoughts? Is it just Microsoft 365 taking its time?
Were these large SharePoint sites?
No, it's only 8 users.
No, but I mean, like, is there a ton of files? Like, do you know how many files are in that SharePoint site that would be synced?
Oh, okay. No, that I don't. There are a fair number of files. Yes. That you think that could be it?
Yeah. So I mean, sync times typically reflect how many files they have and how fast the machine is. If you have, like, 40,000 files in that site collection, it could easily take a few hours to sync, the very first time.
Oh, okay. No, this is, already been synced for years. It's just adding one file and the file doesn't appear on the other machines for a while.
I'd recommend restarting the OneDrive client if that occurs. And if it's
okay.
and if it's a persistent issue, there's a command of if you go to start run and type in OneDrive /reset, it'll stop syncing any of the folders, but it'll give you the ability to do a fresh start, which clears anything that might have been cached or anything that's running behind. The other aspect is to also make sure you're running the latest version of OneDrive. If it's a dated version, like especially if the version's a few years old, there's been all sorts of sync challenges that were around a few years back.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. All right. Good idea. Thank you.
Another way to look at it, Arthur, are there multiple client machines that are having this issue or just one?
Multiple.
Okay, so in that case, that may indicate something server side. And what you may want to do there is re-index the library. And that sometimes gives it an option to kind of flush the system.
Okay, is that through OneDrive or at the?
No, you would do that through, so whatever the library is that's being synchronized, you would go into the settings for that, and then the search and offline options on the settings page. And then there's a button called re-index.
Oh, okay.
And then in the advanced settings for the document library, there's an indexed.
Oh, Bill's here. Yeah. Bill's the one who always is reminding me to do that. So yeah.
Is there an SLA for that? Does anyone know?
An SLA for the re-indexing?
Or no, for the syncing to the clients.
Oh.
It seems like
I didn't think that the sync client used the search APIs at all, so I'm not sure if re-indexing it would have an impact there.
Yeah, no, and to be clear, Dimitri, you're absolutely right, and that's not what I'm indicating. What I'm indicating is sometimes the libraries just get a little mucked up, and that re-index button does a lot more than just re-indexing. It's kind of like I kind of think about it as like rebooting your computer into safe mode. It runs a bunch of diagnostics on it and sometimes flushes out some corruptions or things that get messed up at the library level.
Wow, that's good to know. I didn't know that.
And also the other thing that would also affect performance is that if you have a lot of like broken inheritance and a lot of one-off permissions that you have, that can grind a library list to a halt if there's too many of them.
And then I recommend also training users to only click the sync button once from the root of the document library. If users have not been trained, they tend to sync different folders in the same document library multiple times, and it can be confusing. So if you never had a meet and greet or a training, you try and train everybody, people can be doing different things. Even though the problem may be multiple users, if they've never been trained, multiple users could be clicking multiple folders, clicking sync in multiple places.
Okay. Yeah, I've never shown them how they can actually go to the portal. They don't know about that, so I keep them away.
But if they're accessing it from multiple channels within the same team or something like that, then that would have the effect that Bill's describing as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and Teams is different. Like people can sync each of the channels individually, or they can go to SharePoint, go up to the root. So, there's no clear guidance on this. When you start, do you sync from SharePoint? Do you sync from Teams? Do you do a OneDrive link? It's still kind of mucky,
Yeah, and also as we described in last month's session, there was a lot of talk about the share with OneDrive button, which is now right next to the sync button. And we basically were discussing how you shouldn't ever do both of those things. You want to make sure that your users are doing one or the other, but never both on a given library. that can make life very confusing.
Yeah, it almost comes to adoption thing and a training. It's,
Yeah.
People left to their own devices do different things.
So yeah, so Arthur, I hope that gives you a few ideas of things to try.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, thank you.
All right. Has anyone else run into anything bizarre on the platform lately? All right. Let's go on to the next section. So we are meeting next month on August 18th. We are still finalizing the speaker and the topic. But that being said, we do have a call for speakers. So if you're interested in the coming months, please do let us know. One more thanks to Turn Digital for being the platinum sponsor. But we'd also like to thank all of our past sponsors as well that have been making sure that this community has been possible since we launched, what was it, 7 years ago now, give or take?
7 years ago.
So thank you to all of these. Some of these are actually no longer around. They've been acquired or merged and been bought out.
Our group has outlasted some of our sponsors.